At our son's housewarming, everyone raised their crystal glasses to praise his beautiful new mansion. But while they were toasting his success, my wife spotted something on his mahogany desk that made the room spin. It was a canceled check for $246,000, our entire retirement fund. She looked at me with tears streaming down her face and whispered that our boy had stolen our future. Before the caterers even brought out dessert, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the one piece of paper he never expected us to have: the deed to his perfect new life. My name is Winston. I am 66 years old, a proud black man, and a retired city transit supervisor right here in Atlanta, Georgia. If you are watching this, I need you to take a deep breath and listen closely, because what I am about to tell you is a parent's absolute worst nightmare. It is a betrayal orchestrated by the very blood I would have gladly died to protect. You spend your whole life thinking you know the son you raised. You think you know the values you instilled in him. Wait until you hear what I found hiding behind the closed doors of his brand new mansion. For 35 years, my life was ruled by the rumble of diesel engines and the unforgiving schedule of the city transit system. I woke up at 3 a.m. long before the sun even thought about rising, to make sure the buses ran on time. I breathed in exhaust fumes until my lungs ached. I dealt with broken-down vehicles, angry commuters, and freezing winter mornings where the wind off the concrete felt like razor blades. My hands are rough. They are covered in thick calluses and old scars. But every time I looked at those hands, I felt a deep sense of pride, because those hands were building a foundation for my family. My beautiful wife, Sarah, worked just as hard. She spent decades on her feet managing a busy local diner, coming home smelling like fried food and exhaustion. We did not buy fancy clothes. We did not take luxury vacations. We drove a modest sedan until the wheels practically fell off, and we clipped coupons every Sunday. We tightened our belts so much that sometimes we could barely breathe. And we did it all for one reason: our only son, Derek. We wanted Derek to have the life we never had. We wanted him to walk into rooms without having to prove he belonged there. When he got accepted into a top-tier university, Sarah and I sat at our small kitchen table and cried tears of pure joy. We paid for every single credit hour out of our own pockets. We drained our savings accounts and took on extra shifts so that Derek could graduate completely debt-free. We gave him a clean slate, a head start in a world that is already hard enough on a young black man. And he succeeded. He got a high-paying corporate job, married a woman from a wealthy background, and started living the American dream. I thought we had done our jobs perfectly. I thought my son was a reflection of our hard work and integrity. But greed is a funny thing. It does not care about the sacrifices your parents made. It does not care about blood or loyalty. The nightmare truly began last winter. I was at home enjoying my retirement when my left arm suddenly went numb. The right side of my face drooped, and before I knew what was happening, I was collapsing onto the living room floor. I had suffered a mild stroke. Waking up in that sterile white hospital room was terrifying. I could barely speak clearly. My left side felt like it was made of lead, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the fear of leaving Sarah alone. Derek rushed to the hospital the very next day. He walked in wearing a sharp, tailored suit, looking like the successful businessman we had raised him to be. He held my good hand and looked at me with such deep concern. He told me I needed to focus entirely on resting and recovering. He said the medical bills were going to be complicated and that Sarah was already too stressed to handle the insurance paperwork. Then he pulled a thick stack of papers from his leather briefcase. He told me it was a medical and financial power of attorney. He spoke in a soothing professional voice, explaining that it was just a standard procedure. a formality to allow him to speak to the hospital billing department and manage my medical expenses while I was incapacitated. I am a man who has always taken care of his own business. But lying in that bed feeling weaker than I ever had in my life, I looked at my successful, educated son and felt a wave of relief. I thought this is why we sacrificed everything, so our boy could step up and take care of his old man when the time came. I did not read the fine print. I did not ask questions. I took the pen he handed me, and with a trembling stroke, weakened hand, I signed my name. I signed away my power, believing I was handing it to my protector. Months passed. Through rigorous physical therapy and Sarah's unwavering care, I regained my strength. My speech returned to normal, and I was finally walking without a cane. I thought the worst was behind us. I was just happy to be alive and looking forward to celebrating Derek's latest milestone. He and his wife Jessica had just purchased a massive multi-million-dollar estate in an exclusive, affluent suburb north of the city. The housewarming party was supposed to be a joyous occasion. But the moment Sarah and I pulled our old sedan into the long circular driveway filled with Mercedes and BMW SUVs, a cold knot formed in my stomach. The house was enormous. It had towering white columns, perfectly manicured lawns, and huge windows that glowed with warm light. It looked like a palace. We walked through those grand double doors into a foyer with a sparkling chandelier. The house was packed with Jessica's high society friends. As we stepped inside, the stark contrast between our world and theirs hit me like a physical blow. Sarah was wearing her best Sunday church dress, and I had put on my favorite tailored suit, but we still felt completely out of place. Jessica greeted us with a tight, practiced smile that did not reach her eyes. She is a white American woman who always treated us with a subtle, polished kind of distance. She gave us a quick, obligatory hug and immediately ushered us away from the main gathering area where her wealthy friends were sipping champagne. She guided us toward a small seating area near the kitchen, claiming it would be more comfortable for my recovery. We were being managed. We were being hidden. Derek was across the room laughing and shaking hands with executives. Every time I tried to catch his eye, he conveniently turned away. He was too busy playing the gracious host to acknowledge the parents who had paved the way for his success. Then Jessica's brother Todd strolled over to us. Todd was the real estate broker who had facilitated the purchase of this magnificent home. He was a slick, arrogant man who always smelled like expensive cologne and entitlement. He looked me up and down, a smirk playing on his lips. He leaned against the wall, swirling his drink, and said loud enough for the nearby guests to hear, "It really is a stunning property, isn't it, Winston? Quite an upgrade from the city transit depots. I bet you never imagined your old transit uniform would lead to a place like this." His words were drenched in condescension. He was mocking my life's work. He was reducing 35 years of honest, back-breaking labor into a punchline for his wealthy friends. I felt the familiar heat of anger rising in my chest, but I kept my composure. I squeezed Sarah's hand gently, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. I told him that honest work is nothing to be ashamed of, and that my uniform paid for the education that got Derek into this room. Todd just chuckled, took a sip of his drink, and walked away, dismissing me as if I were part of the hired help. The evening dragged on and the feeling of alienation grew heavier. Derek finally approached us, but he was tense and distant. He gave short, clipped answers to our questions. When Sarah asked for a tour of the new house, Derek immediately stiffened. He quickly showed us the living room and the kitchen, but when we walked past a set of heavy closed double doors down the hallway, he stopped dead in his tracks. "That is my home office," Derek said, his voice dropping into a harsh, commanding tone that I had never heard him use with us before. "Nobody goes in there. It is strictly off limits. I have sensitive corporate documents on my desk, and I do not want anyone messing with them." He looked directly at me when he said it. There was a coldness in his eyes that made my blood run cold. It was not just a boundary. It was a warning. My own son was treating me like a stranger he could not trust in his home. The disrespect from Todd, the subtle segregation from Jessica, and the cold evasion from Derek created a suffocating atmosphere. I felt a deep, aching sorrow for the family dynamic I thought we had. But beneath that sorrow, my instincts as a father and a man who had survived the tough streets of Atlanta started to kick in. Something was terribly wrong. Derek was hiding something, and the truth was waiting right behind those heavy double doors. I sat back down in the isolated corner near the kitchen, watching the party unfold from the shadows. The caterers walked by carrying trays of caviar and imported cheeses. The clinking of crystal glasses and the booming laughter of people who had never known a day of real struggle echoed off the vaulted ceilings. I looked at Sarah, my beautiful, resilient wife. Her shoulders were slightly slumped. The joy she had felt during the car ride over here was completely gone, replaced by a quiet, dignified hurt. She had spent the entire week baking her famous pecan pie, a family tradition, hoping to add a personal touch to Derek's grand celebration. But when we arrived, Jessica had swiftly taken the pie and handed it to a caterer, whispering that it did not quite match the aesthetic of their catered dessert spread. Sarah had smiled and let it go, but I saw the pain in her eyes. It was 1,000 tiny cuts of disrespect layered one on top of the other. I watched my son moving through the crowd. This was the boy I had taught to throw a baseball in the small patch of grass behind our old house. This was the young man I had driven halfway across the country to drop off at his college dormitory, hugging him tight and telling him to make us proud. Now he was wearing a watch that probably cost more than my first car, laughing with men like Todd, who looked down on people like me. The stroke had weakened my body, but my mind was sharper than ever. I replayed the events of the past year in my head. The rushed hospital visit, the stack of legal papers, the sudden explosive wealth that allowed a young couple to buy a multi-million-dollar mansion without selling their previous condo. Derek had always made good money, but this level of opulence seemed to appear out of thin air. Todd's mocking voice echoed in my mind again. He had been too smug. He had spoken with the arrogance of a man who knew a secret. When he brokered this house, he must have seen the financials. He must have known exactly where the money came from, and the way Derek aggressively guarded that office door. It was not the behavior of a man protecting corporate secrets from his parents. It was the behavior of a man hiding a guilty conscience. I leaned closer to Sarah and whispered that we should probably get ready to leave soon. The air in this house was toxic, filled with arrogance and unspoken lies. I told her I just wanted to go home, back to our modest house, where the love was real and the respect was mutual. Sarah nodded gently, her face pale. She patted my knee and whispered that she was going to find the restroom before we made our exit. I watched her walk down the long, brightly lit hallway, her dignified posture a stark contrast to the shallow crowd around us. I had no idea that her simple trip down that hallway was about to shatter our entire reality. I had no idea that the foundation of our family, built on decades of blood, sweat, and unconditional love, was about to be blown to pieces. I sat in that secluded corner near the kitchen for what felt like an eternity. The rhythmic thumping of the bass from the expensive sound system vibrated through the hardwood floors, traveling right up through the soles of my shoes. I watched the caterers glide past me carrying silver trays loaded with things I could not even pronounce. I watched Jessica laughing loudly, with a group of women draped in silk and diamonds, her head thrown back, a picture of absolute careless wealth. Todd was holding court near the fireplace, swirling his scotch, gesturing wildly as he probably bragged about another real estate conquest. And Derek, my own flesh and blood, was standing right beside him, nodding along, desperate to fit into a world that looked down on the very people who had given him life. 10 minutes went by. Then 15. Sarah had only gone to find a quiet restroom down the hall, away from the crowded guest bathrooms near the living area. She always hated loud crowds, and I knew this party was draining her spirit. But she had been gone too long. A prickle of unease started to crawl up the back of my neck. My instincts, honed from decades of managing chaotic transit depots and reading people on the tough streets of Atlanta, told me something was out of place. I pushed myself up from the armchair. My left leg still felt a little stiff from the stroke, but I ignored the dull ache and walked out of the shadow of the kitchen archway. I moved past the wealthy guests who did not even bother to glance in my direction. I was invisible to them. Just an old black man in an outdated suit, completely irrelevant to their high society celebration. I slipped away from the noise and turned down the long, brightly lit corridor that led to the private bedrooms and that forbidden home office Derek had been so aggressive about earlier. The hallway was lined with expensive modern art and plush runner rugs that completely swallowed the sound of my footsteps. The deeper I walked into the private wing of the mansion, the quieter it became. The booming music from the living room faded into a muffled hum. Then I saw her. Sarah was standing frozen in the middle of the hallway, just outside the heavy mahogany double doors of Derek's office. The doors were no longer shut tight. One of them was pushed open just a few inches, creating a narrow gap of light spilling out onto the hallway floor. I quickened my pace. Sarah had her back to me, but I could see her shoulders trembling violently. She was clutching a manila folder against her chest with both hands, as if she were trying to shield her heart from a physical blow. I called out her name in a harsh whisper. She turned around, and the look on her face will haunt me until the day I take my last breath. All the color had completely drained from her beautiful brown skin. She looked like she had just witnessed a murder. Her eyes were wide, filled to the brim with tears that were spilling over her eyelashes and running down her cheeks in silent, rapid streams. She was gasping for air, taking shallow, frantic breaths, unable to form a single word. I reached her in 3 large strides. I grabbed her by the shoulders to steady her, terrified that she was having a heart attack. I asked her what was wrong, what had happened. She could not speak. She just shook her head, let out a choked, devastated sob, and pushed the manila folder into my hands. I looked down at the folder. It was thick, heavy, and smelled faintly of fresh printer ink. I opened it. The first page was a bank statement. But it was not just any bank statement. The logo at the top belonged to the financial institution that held my and Sarah's joint retirement trust. The account we had spent 35 years building. The account that held the blood, sweat, and diesel smoke of my entire adult life. I stared at the numbers printed on the page, my brain struggling to process what my eyes were seeing. The balance at the top of the page read 0. A cold numbness started at my fingertips and rapidly spread up my arms. I flipped to the next page. Clipped to a transaction summary was a high-quality scanned copy of a canceled cashier's check. The amount written on that check was $246,000. Every single penny of our life savings. The money that was supposed to pay for our medical care in our old age. The money that was supposed to ensure Sarah would never have to worry if I passed away before her. It was all gone in one single transaction. I forced my eyes to look at the payee line. The money had been transferred directly to a commercial escrow account. Right below that, the memo line was filled out in stark, undeniable print. It read, "Cash payment for property. Derek and Jessica, LLC." The air vanished from my lungs. The massive, beautiful house we were standing in, the crystal chandeliers, the marble countertops, the manicured lawns. None of it was bought with Derek's corporate success. It was bought with my life. It was bought with the double shifts I worked during the freezing Atlanta winters. It was bought with the aching joints Sarah endured after standing on her feet for 12 hours a day at the diner. Derek had taken the very foundation of our survival and turned it into a luxury playground for himself and his snobby wife. But the true horror, the detail that actually shattered my soul into a million jagged pieces, was at the bottom of the check. I stared at the signature, authorizing the massive withdrawal. It was my name. Winston. But I had never signed that piece of paper. I looked closer at the ink strokes on the scanned copy, and a wave of pure concentrated evil washed over me. The signature was forged, but it was not just a simple forgery. The letters were jagged. The loops were shaky and uneven. The lines trailed off weakly at the end of my last name. Derek had deliberately practiced mimicking the tremor in my hand. He had intentionally copied the weak, unsteady handwriting of a man who had just suffered a stroke. He used my physical vulnerability, the most terrifying moment of my life, as a blueprint to steal my identity and rob me blind. He did not just take our money. He weaponized my illness against me. While I was lying in a hospital bed, trying to relearn how to hold a cup of water, my son was sitting at a desk, perfecting the shaky signature of a crippled old man, so he could impress a woman who looked down on his parents. The physical pain that hit my chest in that moment was completely indescribable. It was worse, far worse than the stroke itself. My stroke had only threatened to stop my heart. This piece of paper threatened to destroy my entire existence. I felt a crushing, suffocating weight pressing down on my ribs. My knees buckled slightly, and I had to lean heavily against the hallway wall to keep from collapsing onto the plush runner rug. Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging into my suit jacket. She was weeping openly now, the sound muffled against my shoulder. She kept whispering over and over, telling me that he stole our future, that our baby boy had stolen our entire lives. Through the narrow gap in the double doors, I could see Derek's office. I could see the massive mahogany desk where this folder had been carelessly left open. He was so arrogant, so absolutely confident in his own superiority, that he did not even bother to lock his stolen secrets away in a drawer. He assumed his old, uneducated parents would simply sit in the corner near the kitchen, too intimidated by the wealth around them to ever go wandering down the hall. He thought we were stupid. Sarah suddenly pulled away from me. Her sorrow was rapidly transforming into maternal rage. She wiped her face aggressively, her eyes flashing with a wild, desperate fire. She turned toward the hallway, marching back toward the living room where the music was playing. She whispered furiously that she was going to drag him out in front of all his fancy friends. She was going to scream it from the balcony. She was going to smash the champagne glasses and tell the whole world that the prince of the suburbs was nothing but a common thief who robbed his own sick father. I reached out and grabbed her wrist. I pulled her back into the shadows of the corridor, gripping her tightly. I looked deep into her tear-filled eyes and shook my head. The raw grief inside me was gone. The shock was completely burned away. In its place, a cold, dark, calculating fury took absolute control of my mind. I was no longer a heartbroken father. I was a man standing in enemy territory preparing for war. If we marched out there right now and caused a scene, we would lose everything. We were in a house owned by Derek and Jessica LLC. We were surrounded by Todd's wealthy friends, local politicians, and likely off-duty police officers hired as private security for the evening. If a black man and woman in their 60s started screaming about stolen money in the middle of a high-society housewarming, we would not be seen as victims. We would be treated as crazy, unhinged relatives causing a disturbance. Derek would play the victim. Jessica would call security to have us physically removed from the premises. And the moment we were thrown out the front door, Derek would sprint back to this office, run that folder through a paper shredder, and completely destroy the only physical evidence we had. We could not afford to fight with emotion. We had to fight with strategy. I whispered to Sarah, my voice dropping into a low, harsh register she had rarely heard in our 35 years of marriage. I told her that if we yelled now, the boy wins. I told her we were going to be smarter than him. We were going to be absolutely silent. I pulled my smartphone from my jacket pocket. My hands had completely stopped shaking. The tremor from the stroke was entirely absent, replaced by the steady grip of a man with a singular purpose. I opened the folder under the glow of the hallway sconce. I made sure the lighting was perfect. I took a high-resolution photograph of the bank statement showing the zero balance. I flipped the page and took 3 separate crystal-clear photographs of the canceled cashier's check. I made absolutely sure the forged, shaky signature, the amount, and the memo line showing Derek and Jessica LLC were perfectly legible in the digital images. Once I was certain the evidence was secured on my phone, I carefully closed the manila folder. I pushed the heavy mahogany door open just a few more inches, slipped silently into Derek's office, and placed the folder back on the exact spot on his desk where Sarah had found it. I positioned it perfectly, ensuring not a single edge was out of place. I backed out of the room and pulled the door shut, leaving the narrow gap exactly as it had been. I turned back to my wife. I took my handkerchief from my pocket and gently wiped the mascara from beneath her eyes. I smoothed the lapels of my suit. I told her to lift her chin, square her shoulders, and walk out of this house with the exact same dignity she had walked in with. We linked arms and walked slowly back down the hallway, leaving the quiet wing of the house behind. We stepped back into the booming noise of the party. The caterers were still carrying champagne. Todd was still laughing loudly near the fireplace. Derek was standing by the large bay windows, looking out over his stolen kingdom. He glanced over his shoulder and saw us walking toward the front foyer. He immediately excused himself from his conversation and jogged over to us, putting on that fake, concerned expression again. He asked us why we were leaving so early, claiming they were just about to serve dessert. I looked my son directly in the eyes. I did not flinch. I did not betray a single ounce of the violence raging inside my chest. I gave him a calm, polite smile, the kind of smile you give a stranger on the bus. I told him that the loud music was giving his mother a headache and that my leg was starting to cramp up from the stroke recovery. I told him the house was absolutely beautiful and that we were very proud of the life he had built for himself. Derek visibly relaxed, entirely convinced of his own brilliance. He patted my shoulder with a condescending smirk, telling us to drive safe in our old car and that he would call us sometime next week to check in on my health. We walked out the massive front doors into the freezing night air. We did not look back. We climbed into our beat-up sedan, the engine sputtering to life in the driveway of the mansion we had unknowingly purchased. I gripped the steering wheel, staring at the glowing windows of the house. Derek thought he had won. He thought he had outsmarted the old man. But he had just made the deadliest mistake of his miserable life. He left the evidence alive, and I was going to use it to burn his perfect suburban kingdom completely to the ground. The sun crept through the sheer curtains of our modest living room the next morning, casting long, pale shadows across the worn carpet. I sat in my favorite armchair, the one with the frayed armrests where I had spent countless evenings resting my aching bones after a brutal shift at the transit depot. The silence in the house was heavy, suffocating. It was not the peaceful quiet of a Sunday morning. It was the thick, unbearable stillness that follows a catastrophic storm. Sarah sat across from me at the small wooden dining table. She had a mug of black coffee cradled in her hands, but she had not taken a single sip. Her eyes were fixed on the digital clock on the microwave, watching the red numbers flip forward. Neither of us had slept a wink. We had spent the entire night lying in the dark, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the digital images burned into my smartphone. The canceled check, the zero balance, the forged signature that mimicked my stroke-weakened hand. We were two parents mourning the death of a son who was still very much alive. But mourning was a luxury we could no longer afford. I needed to know the absolute depth of his deception. I needed to look into the abyss and see just how far my own flesh and blood was willing to go. I looked up at the ceiling above the hallway. There was a faint yellowish water stain shaped like a crescent moon left over from a heavy Georgia rainstorm a few weeks back. We had been meaning to get the roof patched. It was a minor repair, something we could easily handle, but staring at that stain gave me the perfect ammunition for the trap I was about to set. I picked up my cell phone from the coffee table. My thumb hovered over Derek's contact name. A part of my soul, the tender, foolish part of a father's heart, silently begged for this all to be a misunderstanding. I prayed that when I called him, he would break down, confess to borrowing the money, and beg for our forgiveness. I prayed for a sliver of humanity. I pressed the call button and placed the phone on the center of the dining table, turning on the speaker so Sarah could hear every word. The phone rang 3 times. With every ring, my chest tightened. Finally, the line clicked open. Derek answered with that brisk, polished tone he reserved for his corporate colleagues. He sounded important, terribly busy, and completely unbothered. He greeted me casually, asking how I was feeling this morning and making a brief, hollow apology for not spending more time with us at the housewarming party the night before. He claimed he was just pulling into his office parking garage and only had a few minutes before a major strategy meeting. I closed my eyes, summoning every ounce of restraint I possessed. I forced my voice to sound old, tired, and slightly confused, playing the exact role he expected of a man recovering from a neurological episode. I told him that his mother and I had a wonderful time at his new home. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat and praised the architecture, the neighborhood, and the success he had achieved. Then I let out a heavy manufactured sigh. I told him we had a bit of a situation at our house. I explained that the old water stain on the ceiling had started dripping again during the night. I told him the roofing contractor quoted us about $10,000 for a complete repair of that section, and that we did not have that kind of cash sitting in our daily checking account. I kept my tone gentle, almost apologetic. I asked him if he could contact our trust manager and withdraw $10,000 from our retirement fund so we could pay the roofers by the end of the week. I held my breath, waiting for his response. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, bracing herself. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. It was not a pause of panic. It was the calculated silence of a predator pivoting to a new strategy. When Derek finally spoke, his voice was draped in a thick, suffocating layer of fake sympathy. He did not stutter. He did not hesitate. He delivered a lie so smooth, so utterly flawless, that it completely chilled my blood. He let out a long, theatrical sigh. He told me he was so sorry about the roof, but that he had some bad news regarding the trust. He lowered his voice, adopting the tone of a protective financial advisor, shielding an ignorant client from complex economic realities. He spun a masterful, terrifying web of deceit. He claimed that the global markets had taken a massive, unexpected dive over the past quarter. He used big, confusing words talking about volatile index funds, aggressive market corrections, and fiduciary protocols. He told me that our trust manager had panicked and temporarily locked all the accounts to prevent further losses. He outright lied, stating that the funds were completely frozen in a defensive portfolio, and that withdrawing even a single dollar right now would incur massive federal penalties and permanently damage our principal balance. I stared at the phone on the table. The sheer audacity of his words made the room spin. He was sitting in a multi-million-dollar mansion, bought entirely with my stolen money, calmly telling his sick father that a phantom market crash had locked away his life savings. But he did not stop there. The cruelty escalated. Derek adopted a condescending, patronizing tone. He told me that I did not need to worry my recovering brain with these stressful financial matters. He reminded me that I still received my monthly Social Security checks and my small transit union pension. He chuckled softly, a sound that felt like a knife twisting directly into my ribs. He told me that a $10,000 roof repair was a luxury we simply could not afford right now. He suggested that I climb up a ladder and patch the leak myself with some cheap tar, or put a bucket under the drip until the so-called market stabilized in a few years. He actually told me his own father to live within my fixed means. He said that at our age, Sarah and I hardly needed anything anyway. He suggested we cut back on our grocery bills and maybe cancel our cable television subscription to save up for the roof patch. He promised that as the acting power of attorney, he was doing everything in his power to protect our future, and that I just needed to trust his financial expertise. He ended the call by saying he loved us, but he really had to run to his meeting with the board of directors. He hung up, leaving a sharp, dead dial tone echoing through our modest kitchen. Sarah let out a sharp gasp, burying her face in her hands. She wept with a quiet, devastating intensity. Her tears were not for the lost money. They were for the death of our child's soul. I sat frozen in my armchair. The profound agony that washed over me was a physical weight pressing down on my chest until I could barely draw a breath. It was a pain that transcended betrayal. It was the complete obliteration of my reality. My mind violently flashed back through the decades. I remembered a blazing hot summer afternoon in 1994. I remembered running alongside a small bicycle on the sidewalk in front of this very house. I remembered holding the back of the seat, sweating through my work shirt, shouting words of encouragement as a tiny, terrified Derek pedaled furiously. I remembered the exact moment I let go, watching him ride on his own for the first time, his face lighting up with pure, innocent triumph. I remembered working a grueling 20-hour double shift on Christmas Eve, just so I could buy him the expensive chemistry set he had begged for all year. I remembered looking down at his sleeping face when he was a boy, silently promising the universe that I would endure any hardship, suffer any indignity, just to make sure he grew up safe, strong, and honorable. I had poured every ounce of my humanity into that boy. I had given him my morality, my work ethic, and my absolute devotion. And this was the result. The young man on the other end of that phone call was not my son. My son was gone. The creature wearing his face was a greedy, hollow, heartless monster. A sociopath who could cheerfully sip imported champagne in a stolen mansion while telling his disabled father to climb a ladder and patch a roof with cheap tar. He felt absolutely no remorse. He believed he was entirely entitled to the fruits of my labor. He viewed my stroke not as a family tragedy, but as a convenient financial opportunity. I looked at the water stain on the ceiling. I looked at the worn-out shoes sitting by the front door, the shoes I had worn for 5 years to save money for his college tuition. The profound sorrow that had gripped my throat slowly began to evaporate. The crushing weight of grief was replaced by something entirely different. A cold, brilliant clarity settled over my mind. The burning sting of betrayal hardened into an unbreakable diamond-solid resolve. I was an old man, and my body had been betrayed by illness, but my spirit was forged in the fire of 1,000 hardships. I had survived the unforgiving streets of this city. I had survived a lifetime of systemic hurdles, racial prejudice, and backbreaking labor. I had built my kingdom brick by brick, dollar by dollar. No arrogant, entitled thief was going to strip me of my dignity and leave me and my wife destitute in our twilight years, especially not the thief I had raised. The time for tears was over. The time for parental forgiveness had expired the second he told me to live on Social Security while he slept in a stolen palace. I reached across the table and gently took Sarah's hands, pulling them away from her tear-stained face. I looked directly into her beautiful, heartbroken eyes. I did not offer her empty comforts. I did not tell her everything was going to be all right. I told her the absolute truth. I told her that the boy we raised was dead, but the man who robbed us was going to face a reckoning he could not possibly comprehend. My voice was steady, resonant, with a quiet, lethal authority. I told her to dry her eyes and go put on her best coat. We were not going to sit in this house and play the role of helpless victims. We were going to step out that front door and begin the systematic, ruthless dismantling of Derek's perfect stolen life. The grief was entirely gone now, completely consumed by a burning, unquenchable demand for justice. The war had officially begun. We sat in the dead silence of our kitchen for what felt like hours after that phone call ended. The dial tone had long since faded, but Derek's condescending voice still echoed off the walls. He had told me to patch my own roof with cheap tar. He had told me to live within my means. I looked down at my hands resting on the worn wooden table. These were the hands that had steered massive city buses through blizzards and thunderstorms. These were the hands that had gripped a wrench late at night to fix our plumbing, because we could not afford a professional saving every spare dollar for his college fund. And now those same hands were trembling not from the lingering weakness of a stroke, but from an explosive, consuming fury. Sarah did not say a word. She did not need to. The tears had completely dried on her cheeks, leaving behind a hardened, stoic expression I had only seen a few times in our 35 years of marriage. She stood up, walked into the bedroom, and came back wearing her heavy winter coat. She picked up her purse, looked me dead in the eye, and nodded toward the front door. We were not going to sit around and mourn a son who had chosen to bury us alive. We were going to war. The drive to the downtown bank branch was a blur of gray skies and endless concrete. The city of Atlanta was bustling with its usual morning chaos, commuters rushing to jobs they hated, delivery trucks navigating narrow lanes. It was the world I had managed for decades, but today I felt entirely disconnected from it. I was hyper-focused, my mind operating with a terrifying surgical precision. The shock was completely gone. In its place was a relentless drive to uncover every single layer of this deception. We pulled into the parking garage of the towering glass and steel building that housed our primary financial institution. Walking through the polished, revolving doors, the contrast between our modest reality and the sterile, wealthy environment of the bank was glaring. The lobby was expansive, featuring imported marble floors and hushed classical music playing from hidden speakers. It was a place designed to make regular, hard-working folks feel small. But I was not feeling small today. I walked directly past the velvet ropes and the long line of customers waiting for the tellers. I approached the reception desk with long, purposeful strides. The young receptionist barely looked up from her computer monitor, offering a rehearsed, robotic greeting. I did not return the pleasantry. I placed my rough, calloused hands flat on her immaculate desk, leaned forward, and stated my name. I told her I needed to speak with Mr. Henderson, the senior branch manager, immediately. When she hesitated, asking if I had a scheduled appointment, my voice dropped into a register that commanded absolute authority. I informed her that $250,000 had vanished from my retirement trust, and if the manager was not standing in front of me within 60 seconds, my next conversation would be with federal banking regulators and the local news stations. Her practiced smile vanished instantly. The color drained from her face as she frantically picked up her phone. Less than a minute later, a sharply dressed man in his late 50s hurried out of a corner office. Mr. Henderson was wiping sweat from his forehead before he even reached us. He extended a trembling hand, ushering Sarah and me into his private suite, and quickly shutting the heavy oak door behind us to seal off the lobby. He offered us coffee water, anything to stall the inevitable confrontation. I cut him off mid-sentence. I sat down in the leather guest chair, kept my posture rigid, and demanded to see the complete, unredacted transaction history of my revocable living trust. I wanted every signature, every authorization form, and every digital footprint associated with the withdrawal of $246,000. Mr. Henderson swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his tight collar. He swiveled his monitor, typed frantically on his keyboard, and sent a massive file to his private printer. The machine whirred to life, spitting out pages that represented my entire life's work. He gathered the thick stack, stapled the corners, and slid the file across the polished desk toward me. He cleared his throat and defensively stated that the withdrawal had been processed entirely by the book. He claimed the bank had simply followed the legal directives authorized by my designated power of attorney. He handed me the specific legal document Derek had presented to the tellers. I picked up the thick packet of paper. As my eyes scanned the dense, convoluted legal jargon, the horrifying mechanics of my son's betrayal finally came into sharp, agonizing focus. This was the exact document Derek had shoved in front of me while I was lying in the stroke ward. My memory violently flashed back to that sterile hospital room. I remembered the smell of the antiseptic, the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor, and the terrifying numbness on the left side of my body. I remembered Derek rushing in, playing the role of the terrified, devoted son perfectly. He had gripped my hand, crying fake tears, telling me I needed to rest and let him handle the overwhelming hospital billing department. He had presented this document as a simple medical proxy, a temporary measure to protect Sarah from the stress of dealing with insurance adjusters. I had trusted my boy. I had taken the heavy silver pen he offered and signed the last page, my handwriting, a jagged, shaky mess compared to my usual strong signature. But looking at the complete document now sitting in the harsh lighting of the bank manager's office, I saw the true extent of his monstrous deceit. Derek had not just asked me to sign a medical proxy. Meticulously slipped into the middle of the stack, buried beneath pages of standard healthcare authorizations and privacy waivers, was an extra highly specialized addendum. It was a sweeping, absolute financial clause. It explicitly granted Derek unrestricted asset transfer rights. It gave him the absolute legal authority to liquidate trusts' close investment accounts and wire massive sums of cash without ever needing my verbal confirmation or a secondary signature. He had weaponized my medical emergency while I was struggling to form coherent sentences, terrified that I might not live to see another Thanksgiving. My own son was slipping a financial death warrant into a stack of hospital forms. He had planned this with terrifying precision. He knew the bank would require specific ironclad verbiage to bypass the security protections on a high-value trust, and he made absolutely sure that language was hidden right where a sick, exhausted old man would never notice it. The cold, sociopathic nature of his actions made my stomach violently churn. He didn't just steal from me in a moment of panic. He had engineered the complete destruction of his parents' future while pretending to be our savior. I pushed the fraudulent power of attorney document aside, my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. I pulled the actual wire transfer receipt toward me. I needed to see exactly where my life savings had landed. I traced the routing numbers and the receiving account details with my index finger. The funds had not gone straight into Derek's personal checking account. That would have been too obvious, too easily tracked. Instead, the money had been wired directly into a commercial real estate escrow account. I stared at the name of the managing firm printed in bold black letters at the top of the receipt. The words seemed to burn themselves directly into my retinas. The escrow account was managed by a premium boutique real estate brokerage based in the affluent northern suburbs. I recognized the name immediately. It was the exact firm where Jessica's brother Todd was listed as a senior managing partner. The walls of the manager's office seemed to aggressively close in on me as the conspiracy deepened, revealing a web of betrayal far more massive and coordinated than I had ever imagined. This was not just a solitary act of greed by a desperate son. This was a highly organized, flawlessly executed family heist. Derek, Jessica, and Todd had worked together to completely drain my accounts and launder the money through a legitimate property purchase. I sat back in the chair, the pieces of the puzzle violently snapping together in my mind. Todd had been the broker for the multi-million-dollar mansion. He had facilitated the closing using my stolen retirement funds, hiding the transaction behind the protective veil of his brokerage's escrow accounts. And because he was the broker on record for the purchase, he had undoubtedly pocketed a massive lucrative commission directly from the sale. He had gotten rich off the blood sweat and diesel smoke I spilled managing transit routes in the blistering Georgia heat. My mind rushed back to the housewarming party the night before. I remembered Todd standing by the massive stone fireplace, swirling his expensive scotch, looking down his nose at me. I remembered his smug, punchable face as he mocked my old transit uniform and told me I could never have imagined a place like his sister's new home. He wasn't just being an elitist snob. He was actively, deliberately mocking the victim of his own heist. He was laughing right in my face, secure in the absolute knowledge that his tailored suit, his luxury car, and his premium scotch were all paid for by the exhausted, hard-working black man sitting quietly in the corner. And Jessica. Jessica, who had immediately segregated Sarah and me from her high society friends the moment we walked through the door. Jessica, who had sneered at my wife's homemade pecan pie and handed it to the hired help. She knew exactly whose money bought the crystal chandeliers hanging above her head and the imported marble countertops she was showing off to her guests. She and Derek had happily sacrificed my wife's security, my medical care, and our entire future to fund their lavish, fake suburban royalty lifestyle. They were parasites feeding off the carcass of our hard work. I looked over at Sarah. She was leaning forward reading the routing information and Todd's brokerage name over my shoulder. I saw the exact moment the realization hit her. Her eyes widened in absolute horror, and a sharp, quiet gasp escaped her lips. She covered her mouth with her hand, her entire body shaking with revulsion. We had been humiliated, mocked, and dismissed by a group of people who were literally financing their extreme arrogance with our stolen savings. The sheer, unadulterated evil of it was breathtaking. They had sat in that mansion, clinking their champagne glasses, toasting to their success, celebrating the complete financial ruin of two elderly people who had never done anything but offer them unconditional love. I turned my attention back to Mr. Henderson. The manager was sitting completely still, looking terrified, clearly realizing the bank had unwittingly facilitated a massive case of elder financial abuse. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I spoke with a quiet, lethal calm that commanded the room. I thanked him for his time. I instructed him to make certified, bank-stamped copies of every single document on his desk, including the fraudulent power of attorney, the complete transaction history, the wire transfer receipt, and the detailed escrow account routing information. The manager, sensing the massive legal liability looming over his branch, complied immediately. He did not ask any further questions. He simply gathered the papers, stamped each page with the official bank seal, and handed them over with trembling hands. I gathered the thick stack of certified evidence and slid them carefully into a secure leather folder I had brought with me. I stood up from the desk. I felt taller, stronger, and more dangerous than I had in 20 years. The stroke had taken a temporary toll on my physical body, but this devastating betrayal had completely resurrected my spirit. I was no longer a retired, vulnerable old man trying to recover his health in the quiet suburbs. I was a father who had just watched his own son plunge a knife into his back, twist it, and laugh. I took Sarah's arm and led her out of the manager's office. We walked through the luxurious bank lobby and stepped back into the cold Atlanta air. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel an ounce of despair or sorrow. Every soft, forgiving part of my parental heart had been surgically removed in that office, entirely replaced by a cold, tactical machinery. Derek, Jessica, and Todd thought they had executed the perfect crime. They thought they had left me with nothing but a fixed income, a leaking roof, and a broken spirit. They assumed I was too old, too sick, and too ignorant to understand the complex financial web they had spun. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They had fundamentally underestimated the relentless resilience of a man who built his entire life from scratch. They had awakened a sleeping giant. I gripped the leather folder containing my arsenal. I was going to use the very documents they created to tear their stolen kingdom apart, brick by miserable brick. The drive back from the bank to our quiet suburban neighborhood was draped in a heavy, suffocating silence. But it was not the silence of defeat. It was the cold, focused quiet of soldiers preparing the battlefield. I kept both hands firmly on the steering wheel, navigating the familiar Atlanta streets, while my mind processed the sheer magnitude of the betrayal we had just uncovered. We pulled into the driveway of our modest brick home, the house where I had taught Derek how to tie his shoes and how to throw a baseball. Looking at the front porch now, the entire history of our family felt poisoned by his greed. But as we stepped through the front door, my sorrow completely hardened into an unbreakable, tactical resolve. This house was no longer just a home. It was going to be our command center. Sarah walked straight into the kitchen and put the kettle on the stove. Her movements were sharp and deliberate. The tears she had shed in the hallway of that stolen mansion and in the branch manager's office had completely evaporated. I took out my smartphone and bypassed the family contacts, scrolling straight to a name I had relied on for over 4 decades. Samuel Washington. Samuel and I went way back to a time before gray hair and retirement funds. We survived the same rough neighborhoods and faced the same uphill battles as young black men trying to carve out a decent life in this city. While I spent my life managing the chaotic transit routes, Samuel took a completely different path. He put himself through night school, earned his degree, and spent 30 years as a senior investigator, hunting down corporate corruption and financial fraud for the state. He had seen every trick, every scam, and every breed of white-collar criminal there was. If anyone could navigate the muddy, treacherous waters of Derek and Todd's conspiracy, it was my oldest friend. When Samuel answered, his voice was deep and rumbling, carrying the weight of a man who had spent a lifetime exposing liars. I did not waste time with pleasantries or small talk. I told him my own son had robbed my retirement blind alongside a slick real estate broker, and that I needed his expert eyes on a stack of bank-certified documents immediately. Samuel did not ask a single unnecessary question. He did not offer hollow pity. He just asked if the coffee was hot, and told me he would be sitting at my kitchen table in 20 minutes. Waiting for his arrival felt like standing dead center in the eye of a hurricane. Sarah poured 2 cups of tea, placing one in front of me. We sat at our old oak kitchen table, the surface covered in the faint scratches and dents of 30 years of family dinners. I laid the heavy leather folder right in the center of the wood. Samuel arrived exactly 20 minutes later, stepping through our front door, wearing his usual sharp tweed coat and carrying a battered leather briefcase that had probably seen more criminal evidence than most police precincts. He gave Sarah a warm, respectful hug and gripped my hand with a firm, knowing squeeze. There was a grim understanding in his eyes. He had investigated strangers ripping off the elderly for decades, but sitting across from a lifelong friend whose own flesh and blood had committed the ultimate betrayal, was an entirely different kind of darkness. He took a seat at the kitchen table, put on his reading glasses, and opened my leather folder. For the next 45 minutes, the only sounds in our house were the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the crisp turning of bank-certified pages. Samuel methodically reviewed the forged medical proxy. He analyzed the wire transfer receipts line by line. He scrutinized the routing numbers leading straight into Todd's boutique real estate escrow account. He traced the timeline matching the exact dates of my stroke recovery directly to the massive illicit withdrawal. I watched his jaw tighten. I watched his professional detachment falter for just a fraction of a second as he absorbed the sheer calculated malice of Derek's actions. Samuel finally took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, letting out a long, heavy breath. He looked directly at me and confirmed my absolute worst fears. The execution of the theft was ruthless and highly sophisticated. He explained that Derek had engineered a nearly flawless embezzlement. By embedding the absolute transfer clause deep within a mountain of medical proxy paperwork, he had legally insulated the bank from liability. By funneling the cash directly into Todd's escrow account, they had effectively laundered the retirement funds into a clean real estate transaction. Samuel admitted that fighting this in a standard civil court would be a brutal, exhausting nightmare that could drag on for years, draining whatever financial and emotional resources we had left. Todd and Derek had deliberately structured the theft to make us look like confused elderly parents, suffering from buyer's remorse over a legitimate gift. A heavy, suffocating blanket of despair threatened to drop over the kitchen table. Sarah reached out and grabbed my arm, her grip incredibly tight. But I refused to accept defeat. I looked Samuel dead in the eye and told him I did not care how long it took or how hard the fight would be. I told him I was not going to let that arrogant boy and his snobby wife sleep in a mansion bought with my blood and sweat, while Sarah and I clipped coupons to survive. I told him there had to be a mistake. There had to be a blind spot. Criminals as arrogant as Derek and Todd always leave a back door open because they fundamentally believe they are the smartest people in the room. Samuel nodded slowly, a sudden spark of fierce determination igniting in his dark eyes. He opened his battered briefcase and pulled out a fresh yellow legal pad and a silver pen. He asked me to go to my home office and bring him the original formation documents for my retirement account. He wanted the thick, heavy binder I had received 20 years ago when I first set up the fund to protect my assets. I walked down the hall, unlocked my heavy metal filing cabinet, and pulled out the dusty binder. I brought it back to the kitchen and dropped it onto the oak table in front of him. He opened the binder and began to read through the dense legal framework of my original retirement setup. He read slowly, tracing each line of complex text with the tip of his silver pen. 10 minutes went by, then 15. The kitchen was so intensely quiet I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator. Suddenly, Samuel stopped reading. His pen froze halfway down the third page of the primary declaration. He leaned closer to the document, reading the same dense paragraph 3 times over. A slow, deep smile began to spread across his weathered face. It was the terrifying, beautiful smile of a seasoned hunter who had just spotted the fatal mistake in his prey's tracks. He looked up at Sarah and me, his eyes practically burning with triumph. He slapped his hand down on the table with a loud crack that made both of us jump. He declared that Derek and Todd were absolute fools. They thought they had orchestrated the perfect white-collar crime, but their blinding arrogance had completely blinded them to the fundamental mechanics of trust law. Samuel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the scratched oak table. He told us to listen to him very carefully because the weapon we needed to completely destroy Derek's kingdom was hiding right there in plain sight. He pointed to the bold heading of my original document. My retirement fund was not a standard joint savings account. It was a revocable living trust. I had specifically established it that way decades ago on the strict advice of a transit union financial planner to ensure Sarah would seamlessly inherit the funds without dealing with probate courts if I passed away unexpectedly. Samuel explained that a revocable living trust is a distinct, powerful legal entity. It acts as an impenetrable protective vault for your assets. Derek had used his fraudulent power of attorney to breach that vault and wire the funds out. However, because the massive sum of money was transferred directly from the trust account into the real estate escrow account, to purchase the mansion in full, an extraordinary legal mechanism was automatically triggered. He introduced us to a devastating legal doctrine known as a constructive trust. He broke it down into simple, undeniable terms. Under federal and state equitable law, when stolen or embezzled funds belonging to a trust are used to acquire real property, the law absolutely does not recognize the thief as the legitimate owner. It does not matter whose name is printed on the glossy deed filed at the county clerk's office. It does not matter that Derek and Jessica had registered their shiny new limited liability company to hold the title. The law strictly dictates that the property itself becomes a direct substitute for the stolen funds. Samuel looked at me with a fierce, unyielding intensity. He told me that because every single penny used to purchase that sprawling suburban mansion came directly from my revocable living trust, the house legally belonged to the trust. The legal doctrine imposes an automatic constructive trust on the property, meaning Derek and Jessica were holding the title merely as involuntary trustees for my sole benefit. They did not own the house. They never owned the house. They had essentially used my stolen money to buy me a multi-million-dollar piece of real estate. I sat back in my chair, the breath completely knocked out of me. The sheer magnitude of this revelation washed over the kitchen like a tidal wave of pure, absolute justice. Sarah let out a sharp gasp of shock, her hands flying to cover her mouth, as the reality of our power set in. Derek had thought he was a financial genius. Todd had thought he was an untouchable real estate mastermind. But neither of them had bothered to verify the foundational legal classification of the account they were draining. They saw a massive pile of cash and got blinded by greed. They skipped the basic due diligence because they were too busy laughing at the uneducated blue-collar transit worker they were robbing. Their blistering arrogance was going to be their absolute ruin. Samuel was already writing furiously on his legal pad, outlining the exact sequence of our counterstrike. He explained that we did not have to fight a long, grueling civil battle trying to recover missing cash from hidden accounts. The cash was gone, but the physical massive asset was sitting right there in the affluent northern suburbs, waiting for its rightful owner to claim it. We had the bank's certified wire transfer, proving the direct, undeniable chain of custody from my trust to Todd's escrow account. We had the fraudulent power of attorney, proving the malicious intent. We had everything required to walk into a courtroom and legally seize the property from right under their arrogant noses. The beauty of the constructive trust doctrine. Samuel continued, his voice humming with deep professional satisfaction, is that it is designed specifically to prevent unjust enrichment. It is a remedy born from equity. The court recognizes that a thief should never be allowed to profit from their crime. Derek and Jessica had bypassed a traditional mortgage. They had paid for the property entirely in cash to avoid heavy underwriting scrutiny. They thought avoiding a bank loan would keep the transaction swift and securely hidden. But by paying entirely with the stolen trust funds, they had perfectly cemented our claim. There were no secondary lenders to complicate the title. There were no innocent third parties involved. It was a direct, linear pipeline from my lifetime of back-breaking labor straight into the foundation of their luxury estate. I looked down at my rough hands. The thick calluses, the old scars, the permanent stiffness in my knuckles from years of gripping a transit steering wheel. I had traded my physical health for that money. I had missed family gatherings, holidays, and quiet Sunday mornings to ensure that account grew securely. Derek had sneered at my sacrifice. He had treated my legacy as his personal piggy bank. But the law, the very system he thought he could easily manipulate, was about to validate every single drop of my sweat. Sarah stood up from the table, her posture completely transformed. The devastated, heartbroken mother I had held in the hallway of that mansion just 24 hours earlier was entirely gone. In her place stood a fierce, unyielding matriarch ready to reclaim her territory. She walked over to the kitchen counter and poured Samuel a fresh cup of coffee, her movements sharp and deliberate. She looked at our old friend and asked exactly what we needed to do next to take our house back. Samuel took a long sip of the hot coffee, his sharp mind already operating 10 steps ahead of the enemy. He told us that discovering the loophole was only the first phase of the battle. The element of surprise was our most potent, devastating weapon. Derek, Jessica, and Todd were currently operating under the absolute delusion that they had committed the perfect crime. They believed we were sitting in our modest home completely ignorant of their massive theft, or too paralyzed by my medical condition to ever fight back. We had to immediately weaponize their overconfidence. He explained that if we simply confronted them or sent a standard legal demand letter, they would immediately panic and run. Todd, with his shady real estate connections, would attempt to liquidate the property or transfer the title to an offshore shell company. Derek would hire aggressive defense attorneys to stall the proceedings while they drained the equity out of the house. We could not give them a single second to breathe or plan a defense. We had to strike with overwhelming, undeniable legal force before they even realized they were under attack. I sat at the head of my worn kitchen table feeling a profound, monumental shift in the atmosphere of the room. The suffocating despair that had gripped my throat since discovering the canceled check was completely annihilated. It was replaced by a cold, calculated, formidable power. Derek thought he had outsmarted a tired old man. He thought he had left me with nothing but a fixed income and a broken heart. He failed to realize that you do not survive 35 years managing the transit lines of a major American city without learning how to handle a severe crisis. You do not build a $250,000 fortress from scratch without knowing exactly how to defend it. I looked at the documents spread across the table. The forged signature my son had painstakingly practiced to steal my future was no longer a symbol of my vulnerability. It was the undeniable proof of his guilt. The canceled check was not a receipt of our ruin. It was the golden ticket to his absolute destruction. We were not just going to take back our money. We were going to take the very roof over his head, the physical manifestation of his towering arrogance. And we were going to do it completely legally, flawlessly, and without an ounce of mercy. Thursday morning broke with a cold, relentless rain washing over the city of Atlanta. I was already dressed in my best church suit long before the sun even tried to push its way through the heavy gray clouds. My reflection in the bedroom mirror showed a man who had aged 10 years in a single week, but my spine was straight and my jaw was set. The lingering physical weakness from my stroke was entirely eclipsed by a singular burning objective. I was about to drop a massive legal anvil on the son who thought he could discard me like yesterday's trash. Sarah walked into the room wearing her sharpest navy blue dress. She adjusted my tie and smoothed the lapels of my jacket. Her hands were incredibly steady. We did not need to exchange any words of comfort because the shared agony of our betrayal had forged us into a single unyielding weapon. We walked out the front door and stepped into the damp morning air. Samuel was already waiting in our driveway with his engine idling. He had stayed up the entire night drafting the emergency petitions and preparing the exact legal artillery required to stop a $200,000 heist. The drive to the Fulton County Courthouse was a silent, tense journey. The windshield wipers slapped rhythmically against the glass, keeping perfect time with the frantic beating of my heart. I watched the towering skyscrapers and busy intersections go by. I had navigated my massive city buses around these very streets for decades. I had spent my entire adult life moving the people of this city and working honestly within the system. Now I was about to use the highest powers of that very same system to reclaim my stolen legacy. We pulled up to the massive stone steps of the courthouse. The building was an imposing fortress of justice filled with lawyers and desperate people seeking a resolution to their worst nightmares. I gripped my wooden cane firmly, taking each step with deliberate, calculated force. I was not walking through those heavy glass doors as a helpless victim of elder abuse. I was walking in as a father, taking back his kingdom from a treacherous thief. Samuel led the way through the metal detectors. His battered briefcase was gripped tightly in his hand, holding the bank-certified wire transfers, the forged power of attorney, and the digital audio recordings from my smartphone. We bypassed the standard civil filing lines entirely. Samuel knew the labyrinth of these administrative halls like the back of his hand. He marched us straight to the emergency injunction clerk on the 3rd floor. The air in the office was thick with the smell of old paper and stale coffee. We were there to file a formal petition for elder financial abuse. Samuel had explained the immense gravity of this specific charge during our car ride. This was not a simple contract dispute or a basic family disagreement over money. In the state of Georgia, exploiting a physically disabled elderly person for massive financial gain is a severe felony offense. It triggers immediate catastrophic legal mechanisms designed specifically to protect the vulnerable from vicious predators. But the absolute crown jewel of our counterstrike was the second document Samuel slammed onto the clerk's counter. It was a lis pendens. It is a Latin legal term that translates to a notice of pending action. Samuel broke it down for me earlier in terms a blue-collar man could easily grasp. Filing a lis pendens puts a massive, unavoidable red flag directly on the title of the multi-million-dollar mansion. It alerts any bank underwriter or secondary lender that the property is the subject of a severe legal dispute. It is the absolute equivalent of pouring wet concrete directly into the gears of their financial machine. Once that notice is officially stamped by a judge, it becomes legally impossible for Derek to secure his home equity loan. No bank in America will wire $200,000 against a property that might be seized by the court the very next day. The clerk behind the thick glass window reviewed our stack of evidence. She looked at the forged signature, mimicking my stroke tremors. She looked at the undeniable wire transfer receipt, proving my entire retirement trust was funneled directly into Todd's boutique real estate escrow account. Her professional indifference vanished in an instant, replaced by a look of sheer, absolute disgust. She stamped the intake forms with a loud, heavy thud and told us to wait in the long corridor outside the judge's private chambers. The waiting was absolute psychological torture. It was Thursday afternoon. The heavy analog clock on the marble wall ticked relentlessly, echoing down the empty hallway. Every passing minute ratcheted up the suffocating tension in my chest. Derek and Jessica had their loan closing appointment scheduled for 9 o'clock Friday morning. We had less than 20 hours to get a Superior Court judge to review a mountain of evidence, authenticate the emergency petition, and sign the order freezing the house. The timeline was razor thin. If the judge delayed the review until the weekend, the bank would wire the funds. Derek would move the cash to an untraceable offshore account, and my son would vanish to Europe, leaving Sarah and me drowning in his orchestrated foreclosure. I paced the corridor, my cane clicking rhythmically against the polished stone floor. I thought about the sheer audacity of my son. He had sat in my living room smiling in my face while secretly plotting my absolute financial ruin. I wondered if he felt even a fraction of guilt when he forged my name. I wondered if Jessica laughed when she saw my life savings hit their account. The anger burned bright and hot in my veins, keeping my mind razor sharp. Sarah sat on a wooden bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes closed in a silent, desperate prayer. Samuel stood by the large window, watching the city rain fall, with a grim, stoic expression. The stakes were astronomical. We were fighting for our basic survival, our dignity, and the right to live our remaining years in peace. Hours dragged by. The courthouse began to empty out as the afternoon faded into early evening. Lawyers packed their briefcases, and administrative staff turned off their office lights. My stomach tied itself into agonizing knots. The window of opportunity was closing rapidly. If we did not get that signature today, the war was completely lost. Just past 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the heavy wooden door to the chambers finally swung open. The judge's clerk, a young man with a very serious expression, motioned for Samuel to enter. Samuel buttoned his suit jacket, picked up his briefcase, and walked into the room. Sarah reached out and grabbed my hand. Her palm was sweating. I squeezed her fingers, promising her without words that I would not let us fail. 10 agonizing minutes later, Samuel emerged from the heavy doors. He did not speak at first. He simply walked over to us, opened his battered briefcase, and slid a thick stack of papers inside. He snapped the brass locks shut with a sharp, definitive click. Then he looked at me and offered a slow, triumphant smile. He tapped the top of his briefcase. The judge had signed it. Both the emergency injunction for elder financial abuse and the lis pendens were officially enacted. The sheer monumental relief that crashed over me was completely indescribable. The stagnant air rushed back into my lungs. Sarah let out a long, trembling exhale, her shoulders finally dropping from their rigid, defensive posture. We had done it. We had completely severed the financial artery Derek relied on. The title to the mansion was completely frozen. The $200,000 equity loan was officially dead on arrival. The massive, sprawling estate bought with my stolen sweat and blood was now legally locked down, waiting for the court to hand it back to its rightful owner. We walked out of the massive courthouse as the storm finally broke, leaving the Atlanta streets slick and gleaming under the fading sunlight. I felt a profound, immense sense of vindication, washing away the bitter, toxic taste of betrayal. I had survived the hardest blow a father could ever take, and I was still standing tall. I had used the very system my son thought I was too ignorant to understand, to trap him in a cage of his own making. But the absolute most satisfying part of the entire operation was the beautiful, oblivious silence of our enemy. Miles away in their stolen luxury suburb, Derek, Jessica, and Todd were completely ignorant of their impending doom. They had no idea that a judge had just signed away their golden ticket. They were likely sitting in that expansive living room, drinking expensive wine, making dinner reservations, and packing their designer luggage for a European vacation. They were dreaming about the massive pile of cash they thought they were getting tomorrow morning. They truly believed they had committed the perfect crime. They believed they were untouchable high society royalty who had successfully scammed an old, foolish bus driver. They had absolutely no idea that their perfect, pristine reality had just been brutally dismantled. They had no idea that a quiet, retired transit worker had just pulled the legal rug entirely out from under their expensive Italian shoes. The trap was fully set, and the jaws were completely locked. All that was left to do was to walk into their house and watch it snap shut. Thanksgiving afternoon in Georgia usually carries a specific kind of warmth. It is a warmth built on decades of tradition, the smell of collard greens simmering on the stove, and the sound of football playing softly on the living room television. For 35 years, my wife Sarah and I made sure our home was a sanctuary of gratitude. We never had a lot of money, but our table was always full. We gave thanks for our health, for our modest roof, and most importantly for our family. But this year, our kitchen was completely dark. The oven was cold. The air in our small brick house felt painfully still. There was no turkey basting in the oven, and there were no pies cooling on the counter. Instead of bowing our heads in prayer, we were sitting in our beat-up sedan driving north on the interstate, heading straight into the heart of a nightmare. The sky above Atlanta was a brittle, cloudless blue, offering a beautiful autumn day that felt entirely wrong for the mission we were undertaking. I kept both hands firmly planted on the steering wheel. The familiar hum of the engine was the only sound between Sarah and me. We did not need to speak. We had spent the last 48 hours executing a flawless legal strike with my old friend Samuel, securing the emergency injunction and locking down the property title with the county judge. We knew exactly what we held in our hands. We held the absolute destruction of our son's stolen kingdom. But executing a legal maneuver in a quiet courthouse is one thing. Looking the devil in the eye while he celebrates his victory is another. We exited the highway and began navigating the winding, pristine roads of the affluent northern suburbs. The transition from our working-class neighborhood to this enclave of extreme wealth was always jarring. Towering oak trees cast dappled shadows over perfectly manicured lawns. Massive iron gates protected sprawling estates that looked like they belonged in a magazine, not in the real world, where men like me broke their backs managing city transit lines. I drove past these monuments to luxury feeling a cold, hard knot tighten in my stomach. Every single blade of grass on my son's property, every brick in his massive mansion, had been paid for by the $246,000 he had ruthlessly siphoned from my retirement trust. I turned the steering wheel and pulled into the long, sweeping driveway of the estate. The scene before us was a masterclass in sickening extravagance. The driveway was absolutely packed with high-end luxury vehicles. Gleaming silver Mercedes sedans, sleek black BMWs, and massive Range Rovers were lined up like soldiers on parade. A white catering van was parked near the side entrance, its rear doors wide open as staff in crisp black uniforms hurried back and forth carrying silver trays. Derek and Jessica were not just having a quiet family dinner. They were hosting a monumental high society Thanksgiving gala. I parked our old faded sedan right behind a shiny new Porsche, the contrast so stark it was almost comical. I turned the key and the engine sputtered to a halt. I looked over at Sarah. She was wearing her best Sunday dress, a deep burgundy fabric that complemented the fierce, unyielding dignity radiating from her beautiful brown face. She did not look like a victim. She looked like a queen preparing to inspect a rebellion. I reached across the center console and gently took her hand. I squeezed her fingers, drawing strength from the incredible resilience of the woman who had stood by my side through poverty, sickness, and now the ultimate betrayal. I grabbed my wooden cane, pushed open my car door, and stepped out into the crisp autumn air. We did not bother walking up to the grand front entrance. The side doors leading to the massive outdoor patio were pushed wide open, allowing the sounds of laughter, clinking crystal, and smooth jazz music to spill out across the manicured lawn. We walked slowly up the stone pathway, my cane clicking rhythmically against the expensive pavers. Every step I took was deliberate, grounded in the absolute certainty of the trap we had already sprung. They had no idea the judge had signed our injunction. They had no idea the title to this house was entirely frozen. They were completely blind to the fact that their impending $200,000 home equity loan, which they planned to steal on Friday morning, was officially dead in the water. We stepped onto the expansive wooden deck and crossed the threshold into the lion's den. The interior of the mansion was visually staggering. The vaulted ceilings echoed with the booming, arrogant voices of Atlanta's suburban elite. Women draped in designer silk and heavy gold jewelry threw their heads back in exaggerated laughter. Men in custom-tailored blazers stood in tight circles swirling expensive bourbon and bragging about their stock portfolios. The massive dining table in the center of the open-concept living space was a grotesque display of gluttony. Caterers were busy arranging towering displays of artisan food, roasted meats, and overflowing cornucopias that belonged in a museum. This was not a celebration of thankfulness. It was a victory party. They were celebrating the massive payout they believed was hitting their accounts the very next morning. They were toasting to their brilliant, flawless scam, completely convinced they were about to leave an old, stroke-addled bus driver to drown in a catastrophic foreclosure. I stood just inside the threshold, scanning the crowded room, until my eyes locked onto my son. Derek was standing near the massive marble kitchen island, holding a crystal flute of champagne. He looked immaculate, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than my first car. He was smiling broadly, soaking in the admiration of his wealthy guests, playing the role of the self-made corporate prince to absolute perfection. Just a few feet away from him stood Jessica. She was the absolute center of attention, holding court with a group of wives. She was wearing a shimmering emerald gown, her wrist heavy with diamond bracelets. She was gesturing wildly, talking loudly about their upcoming European vacation, the very vacation she planned to fund with my stolen equity. The sheer audacity of her joy made the bile rise in the back of my throat. She was a parasite dancing on the bones of my 35-year career. It took exactly 45 seconds for Derek to notice us. I watched the progression of his reaction like a slow-motion train wreck. First, his eyes casually swept over the room, checking on his guests. Then his gaze snagged on the two elderly black people standing quietly by the patio doors. For a fraction of a second, his brain completely failed to process our presence. Then the realization hit him. The smug, arrogant smile instantly vanished from his face, replaced by a flash of genuine, unadulterated panic. His posture went entirely rigid. He quickly placed his champagne flute down on the marble counter, spilling a few drops of the expensive liquid. He muttered a rapid excuse to the group of executives he was entertaining and began weaving his way through the crowded room toward us. He did not look happy to see his parents on a day meant for family. He looked like a man who had just spotted a cockroach crawling across his pristine dining table. As he closed the distance, he aggressively grabbed my elbow, his fingers digging into the fabric of my suit jacket with an incredibly hostile grip. He leaned in close, his face flushed with anger, dragging Sarah and me away from the main gathering and pushing us toward a secluded corner near the walk-in pantry. He checked over his shoulder, terrified that his high society friends might witness this embarrassing interaction. He kept his voice low, but the venom dripping from his words was unmistakable. He demanded to know what we were doing here. He hissed that we were completely uninvited and that this was a private catered event for his senior partners and elite social circle. He actually had the unbelievable nerve to tell me that our presence was ruining the aesthetic of his dinner party. He looked me up and down, his eyes filled with absolute contempt, sneering at my outdated suit and Sarah's simple dress. He told me that this was not a neighborhood barbecue, and that we could not just show up unannounced, smelling like old mothballs and cheap laundry detergent. I stood perfectly still, letting his insults wash over me. The pain that would have normally shattered a father's heart simply bounced off the impenetrable armor of my resolve. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I looked at the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle. the boy I had worked double shifts in the freezing rain to support and saw absolutely nothing but a hollow, greedy stranger. I calmly told him that it was Thanksgiving and a son should always welcome his parents into his home. I kept my tone mild, almost naive, playing the role of the confused old man he desperately needed me to be. Derek let out a sharp, exasperated breath, running his hand over his perfectly styled hair. He treated me like I was a stubborn, ignorant child. He told me in a harsh whisper that I was embarrassing him. He claimed he was trying to secure a massive international account with the people in this room, and having his blue-collar parents standing around looking out of place was going to destroy his professional credibility. He actually reached into his expensive trousers, pulled out his leather wallet, and tried to hand me a crisp $100 bill. He told me to take Sarah to a nice diner downtown, buy us a good turkey dinner, and go back to our house. He promised he would call us sometime next week when he had a free minute. Before I could even react to the ultimate insult of my own son trying to pay me to leave a house I owned, another voice intruded on our secluded corner. It was a loud, boisterous, incredibly arrogant voice that I recognized instantly from the hidden audio recording. Todd swaggered over to us holding a glass of dark amber liquor. He was clearly intoxicated, his face flushed red from the alcohol and the intoxicating thrill of his impending heist. Jessica's brother was dressed in a velvet dinner jacket, looking every bit the sleazy, overconfident real estate broker he was. He did not bother lowering his voice. He did not care who heard him. He felt absolutely invincible, completely secure in the knowledge that he had successfully laundered $250,000 through his boutique escrow firm. Todd draped a heavy arm around Derek's shoulder, leaning heavily against my son. He looked at me with a smirk so profoundly disrespectful, it made my knuckles ache to grip my cane tighter. He let out a loud, braying laugh and asked Derek why the hired help was standing around chatting when there were empty glasses in the living room. Derek immediately hushed him, looking nervously around the room, but Todd simply waved him off. Todd took a slow, deliberate sip of his expensive bourbon and stepped right into my personal space. He looked down at my worn orthopedic shoes, then let his eyes travel up to my face, his expression dripping with absolute aristocratic mockery. He told me loud enough for the nearest guests to hear that I was completely out of my depth. He sneered that a retired transit worker had absolutely no business breathing the same air as the people in this mansion. He leaned in so close I could smell the alcohol and expensive cigars on his breath. He mocked my lifelong career, asking if I was going to ask his friends for bus fare. He chuckled, looking over at Sarah with a dismissive, disgusting glance. Then he delivered the final crowning insult. Todd told me to take my wife, get back into my rusty, outdated sedan, and drive back to my ghetto porch where we belonged. He stated with absolute blistering arrogance that this was a place for winners, for people who knew how to make real money, not for old, broken-down civil servants collecting government checks. He patted my shoulder, condescendingly mocking the stroke that had nearly taken my life, and told me to be careful not to trip on the expensive marble floors on my way out. The tension in that small corner of the kitchen, what was so incredibly thick, you could have cut it with a carving knife. Derek stood by, saying absolutely nothing to defend us. My own son remained completely silent, while a drunken, sleazy real estate broker viciously insulted his mother and mocked his disabled father. Derek simply stared at the floor, more concerned with his social standing than the brutal humiliation of the people who gave him life. They were at the absolute monumental peak of their hubris. They honestly believed they were gods among men entirely untouchable, standing on the summit of a mountain, built from my stolen life savings. Sarah remained perfectly still beside me, a monument of quiet, terrifying grace. She did not cry. She did not yell. She simply looked at Todd, then at Derek, her eyes cataloging every single ounce of their disrespect, filing it away for the absolute reckoning that was about to crash down upon their heads. I did not take the $100 bill Derek held out to me. I did not raise my cane to strike Todd across his smug, flushed face. I simply stood my ground, leaning on my wooden cane, feeling the absolute power of the secret resting in my pocket. Let them laugh. Let them drink their expensive champagne. Let them toast to their brilliant European getaway and their flawless white-collar crime. They had absolutely no idea that their entire reality was a ghost. They had no idea that the very house they were standing in legally belonged to the old broken-down bus driver they were laughing at. The lions thought they ruled the jungle, completely blind to the fact that the cage door had already slammed permanently shut. The air in that massive dining room was thick with the smell of roasted meats, imported wine, and pure, unadulterated arrogance. I watched my son Derek standing there with his chest puffed out, surrounded by people who did not know the first thing about loyalty or hard work. Todd was still smirking, still nursing his expensive bourbon, thinking he had just put an old, disabled man in his proper place. He thought his cruel little insults about my working-class background had broken my spirit. But a strange, wonderful peace had settled over my entire soul. The anger that had burned inside my chest for the past few days was completely gone. I did not feel the lingering ache in my leg from the stroke. I did not feel like an uninvited victim crashing a high society party. I felt like a judge stepping up to the bench ready to deliver a verdict. I ignored Todd. I did not give him the satisfaction of a response. Instead, I turned my back on his drunken sneer and began walking slowly toward the very center of the room. I moved past the wealthy guests in their designer clothes. They parted from me almost instinctively, confused by the sheer authority radiating from a man they had completely dismissed just moments ago. I gripped my wooden cane firmly, taking each step with deliberate, calculated force. I walked directly to the head of the massive mahogany dining table. It was a beautiful, intimidating piece of furniture, covered in sparkling crystal glasses, fine china, and a Thanksgiving feast that looked like a magazine cover. There were towering displays of autumn vegetables, beautifully carved turkeys, and overflowing cornucopias. Sarah walked right beside me, her chin held high, her presence an unbreakable pillar of strength. She was wearing her simple burgundy Sunday dress, but she carried herself with the fierce, unyielding dignity of a queen inspecting a rebellion. We stood at the head of that magnificent table, claiming our rightful physical space in a house bought entirely with our own blood and sweat. Derek saw me position myself at the head of the table, and his fake corporate smile finally cracked. He pushed his way through a group of local politicians and banking executives, his face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and rising fury. He took a step forward, his voice dropping into a desperate, angry hiss. He told me to stop making a scene right this second. He demanded that I get out of his house before he called his private security team to have us physically removed. He looked around frantically, terrified that his elite social circle was witnessing this uncomfortable family drama. I did not even blink. I did not lower my gaze. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my outdated suit jacket and pulled out the thick, heavy leather folder Samuel had prepared for me. I placed it gently on the pristine white tablecloth right next to a silver gravy boat. The dull, heavy thud of that folder hitting the solid mahogany wood seemed to echo through the entire room. I slowly unfastened the brass clasp. I could feel the eyes of every single guest shifting toward me. The loud, obnoxious conversations began to die down. The clinking of champagne flutes stopped entirely. The smooth jazz playing from the hidden surround sound speakers suddenly felt incredibly loud in the rapidly growing silence. Everyone wanted to know what the old man in the cheap suit was doing standing at the head of the table. I looked down at my son. I looked at the boy I had carried on my shoulders through the crowded streets of downtown Atlanta. I looked at the man who had sold his soul to impress a society that would never truly respect him. I drew in a deep, steady breath. My voice did not shake. It carried the booming, resonant power of a man who had spent 40 years directing transit crews over the roar of massive diesel engines. I told Derek that he thought he was incredibly smart. I told him he truly believed he was dealing with an old, dumb, uneducated bus driver who would just lay down and die quietly. I watched his jaw tighten. I told him he assumed my stroke had left me too weak and too confused to ever understand the sophisticated white-collar crime he and his wife had engineered. I reached into the leather folder and pulled out the first document. It was the bank-certified wire transfer receipt, bearing the heavy blue stamp of the branch manager. I dropped it onto the mahogany table. I raised my voice so every single wealthy executive politician and real estate developer in that room could hear my words clearly. I announced that every single brick of this multi-million-dollar estate, every crystal chandelier hanging above their heads, and every blade of manicured grass outside was purchased entirely with funds stolen directly from my retirement trust. A collective audible gasp rippled through the dining room. Several women covered their mouths in shock. The executives Derek had been trying to impress suddenly took a collective step backward, distancing themselves from him as if he had a contagious disease. Jessica pushed her way to the front of the crowd, her emerald green gown shimmering under the lights. Her face was turning a blotchy, furious red. She opened her mouth to shout something to call me a liar, but I held up my hand, silencing her instantly. I pulled out the fraudulent power of attorney and dropped it right next to the wire transfer. I explained in a calm, lethal voice how my own son had weaponized my medical emergency. I told the room how he had slipped an absolute asset transfer clause into a stack of hospital forms while I was lying in a stroke ward struggling to breathe. I made absolutely sure his colleagues heard exactly what kind of man they were drinking expensive champagne with. I watched the color begin to drain from Derek's face. The arrogant swagger was melting away, leaving behind the terrified posture of a cornered animal. Todd shoved his way forward, his bourbon splashing over the rim of his glass. He pointed a trembling finger at me, slurring his words, demanding that I stop spouting nonsense and leave the property. I turned my attention completely to him and his sister. I told them I knew all about their brilliant, flawless plan. I told them I knew exactly what they had discussed in the back seat of the luxury SUV the night before. I recited their own words back to them. I told them I knew all about the $200,000 home equity loan they were expecting tomorrow morning. I told them I knew about their grand escape to Europe and their sick, twisted plan to leave Sarah and me drowning in a catastrophic foreclosure. Jessica froze. Her mouth fell open, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, realizing that their deepest, darkest secret was now public knowledge. Todd lowered his pointing finger, his drunken bravado completely shattered by the realization that I possessed a hidden audio recording of their entire conspiracy. I leaned forward, resting my calloused hands flat on the table. I looked directly into Derek's terrified eyes and smiled. It was a cold, devastating smile. I pulled out the court-certified emergency injunction and the official notice of pending litigation. I dropped them onto the pile of evidence. I told them the equity loan was officially dead on arrival. I told them I had spent the last 48 hours working with a retired financial fraud investigator, a superior court judge, and state banking regulators. I announced that the bank had officially canceled their loan application this very morning, the second our injunction hit their underwriting department. I told them their personal bank accounts were entirely frozen by federal mandate pending a massive criminal investigation into elder financial abuse. They did not have access to a single dime. Their European vacation was canceled. Their luxury lifestyle was entirely defunded. Derek took a stumbling, shaky step backward. He bumped into the marble kitchen island, grabbing the edge to keep himself from collapsing. He was shaking his head side to side, trying desperately to deny the reality that was crashing down upon his head. He whispered that I could not do this. He whispered that the house was in his name, and that his limited liability company held the legal title. He clung to that single piece of paper like a drowning man holding onto a piece of driftwood. But I was not finished. The true justice, the absolute masterpiece of our legal strike, was still waiting in the folder. I reached into the very back of the leather pouch and pulled out the ultimate weapon. It was the updated court-ordered property deed. Samuel had made absolutely sure it was expedited, processed, and stamped with the heavy, undeniable seal of the Fulton County clerk. I held it up high so the glossy seal caught the light of the crystal chandeliers. I explained the legal doctrine of a constructive trust in plain, simple English, so every single person in that mansion understood exactly what was happening. I told Derek that the law does not reward thieves, because he and Todd had used my stolen trust money to buy the property outright. Without a mortgage, the law automatically recognized my revocable living trust as the sole legitimate owner of the estate. The legal title he thought protected him was completely meaningless. The court had officially declared that he was merely holding the property for my benefit. I slammed the heavy certified deed down onto the mahogany table. The sound cracked through the silent room like a gunshot. I looked Derek directly in the eye and delivered the final fatal blow. I told him he did not own this mansion. I told him he had never owned this mansion. He had simply used my stolen life savings to buy a multi-million-dollar house for his mother and me. I told him he was just an uninvited guest standing in my dining room. The absolute silence that followed was deafening. The wealthy guests, the politicians, and the corporate executives were completely frozen, staring at the destruction of a man they had admired just minutes ago. Derek looked like a ghost. His pristine charcoal suit suddenly looked much too big for his trembling frame. He looked down at the court-ordered deed on the table, and the last remaining shred of his arrogance completely disintegrated. He realized he was standing in a house he could not sell, a house he could not mortgage, and a house he did not own. Jessica finally broke the silence. She let out a piercing, horrific scream. It was not a scream of sorrow. It was the agonizing shriek of a highly materialistic woman, realizing she had just lost everything. She looked at her diamond bracelets. She looked at her emerald gown, and she realized she was completely trapped. She was a broke criminal standing in a house she did not own with absolutely no money in the bank and no way to escape the impending criminal charges. She fell to her knees on the expensive imported marble floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Her perfect socialite facade shattered into a million jagged pieces. Todd dropped his expensive bourbon glass. It shattered against the floor, sending dark liquor and crystal shards flying across the pavers. He backed away toward the patio doors, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated panic, realizing his own real estate brokerage was about to be investigated for laundering stolen trust funds. I stood at the head of the table watching the villains of my story completely collapse under the crushing weight of their own greed. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I reached out and took Sarah by the hand. Her grip was warm and remarkably steady. We had walked into the lion's den, and we had completely dismantled their empire without throwing a single punch. We had used the truth, the law, and an unbreakable sense of justice to take back our lives. I looked down at the Thanksgiving feast spread across my table, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt a profound, genuine sense of gratitude. The absolute stillness in that massive dining room was heavier than any humid Georgia summer afternoon I had ever experienced. The brilliant crystal chandeliers cast a bright, unforgiving light on the absolute ruin of my son. Jessica was still kneeling on the imported marble floor, weeping hysterically, her perfect emerald gown pooled around her like a deflated parachute. The wealthy guests, who just moments ago had been toasting to Derek's corporate brilliance, were now completely frozen. Some of them slowly backed away toward the foyer, treating my son and his wife like they had a highly infectious disease. The elite social circle they had sacrificed my life to impress was abandoning them in the blink of an eye. No one wanted to be standing near a family exploding in a criminal scandal. Todd was leaning against the kitchen island, sweating profusely, his face a mask of absolute terrified panic, as he stared at the shattered pieces of his expensive bourbon glass on the floor. I stood at the head of the table, breathing evenly, my hands resting on the polished mahogany wood. I did not say another word. I had delivered the verdict, and the weight of the truth had completely crushed the air out of their lungs. Then a sound cut through the suffocating quiet. It was the deep, resonant chime of the mansion's front doorbell. It rang twice, echoing down the grand, vaulted hallway. The sound made Derek physically jump, his shoulders violently flinching, as if he had been struck by a whip. Sarah did not wait for a catered servant or a host to answer the door. She was the matriarch of this family, and legally the co-owner of the very ground we stood on. She turned around, her navy blue dress sweeping elegantly, and walked with a slow, steady rhythm down the long corridor toward the massive double doors. The guests parted for her, completely silent, unable to look her in the eye. I heard the heavy latch click open. I heard the low, rumbling murmur of familiar voices. A few seconds later, Sarah walked back into the expansive living area. Right behind her, striding with the heavy, undeniable authority of a man bringing the absolute wrath of the law, was my oldest friend Samuel. He had traded his casual tweed coat for a dark formal suit, holding his battered leather briefcase in one hand. But Samuel was not alone. Stepping into the pristine, opulent dining room right behind the retired investigator were two massive, fully uniformed Fulton County Sheriff's deputies. Their heavy black duty belts creaked in the quiet room, the metallic clinking of handcuffs and radios completely shattering the high society illusion. The visual contrast of rugged blue-collar law enforcement marching into a multi-million-dollar suburban palace was visually staggering. The guests immediately began murmuring in panic. Several corporate executives practically sprinted toward the side patio doors, desperate to escape the premises before anyone could associate their names with a criminal raid. Samuel stopped right next to me at the head of the table. He gave me a single firm nod. Then he turned his sharp, experienced gaze toward the three people cowering in the center of the room. He pointed a steady finger directly at Todd and Derek. The lead deputy, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern expression, stepped forward. He did not care about the crystal glasses or the expensive roasted turkey sitting on the table. He looked at Todd first. He asked if he was Todd Harrison, the managing partner of the boutique real estate brokerage. Todd tried to stand up straight, trying desperately to summon his usual sleazy, arrogant charm. He raised his hands, palms facing outward, trying to use his wealthy status to intimidate the officer. He stammered that there was a massive misunderstanding, that he knew the district attorney personally, and that he could clear this entire clerical error up with a single phone call. The deputy did not even blink. He reached out, grabbed Todd roughly by the shoulder, spun him around, and slammed his arms behind his back. The sharp, aggressive, metallic snap of the steel handcuffs closing around Todd's wrists echoed like a gunshot. The deputy recited the charges in a loud, booming voice that filled every corner of the vaulted ceiling. He announced that Todd was under arrest for felony elder financial abuse, interstate wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. Todd's face drained of all color, turning a sickly pale gray. His knees buckled slightly, and the second deputy had to hold him up by the back of his velvet dinner jacket. The arrogant broker who had told me to go back to my ghetto porch just 10 minutes ago was now a whimpering, humiliated criminal. Then the lead deputy turned his attention to Jessica. He pulled out a secondary warrant and informed her that she was being detained as an active co-conspirator in the massive financial fraud scheme. The moment the officer reached for her arm, Jessica completely lost her mind. The sheer terror of losing her wealth and facing a prison cell entirely stripped away her fake suburban royalty facade. She transformed into a cornered, vicious animal. She violently jerked her arm away from the officer and turned her absolute fury onto her own family. She pointed a shaking, manic finger at Todd, screaming at the top of her lungs. She shrieked that the escrow laundering was entirely his brilliant idea, that he was the one who forged the banking connections. She screamed that he had completely ruined her perfect life. Then she spun around and unleashed her venom on Derek. She called her husband a weak, pathetic mama's boy. She screamed that he was too stupid to even steal properly, that he had botched the entire operation by leaving a paper trail. The ugly, vile nature of her heart was fully exposed for every remaining guest to witness. She had no loyalty, no love, and absolutely no soul. The deputies did not tolerate her outburst. They grabbed her arms forcefully, pinned her wrists together, and locked the steel cuffs over her delicate skin. She kicked and screamed hysterically as they dragged her toward the front door, her emerald gown dragging across the imported marble. Finally, the lead deputy walked over to the kitchen island where my son was standing. Derek did not try to run. He did not try to argue with the officer. He watched his wife and his brother-in-law get dragged out of the house in chains, and his entire reality completely shattered. The corporate prince, the financial mastermind, the arrogant boy who told his disabled father to patch a leaking roof with cheap tar, simply ceased to exist. As the deputy reached for his shoulder, Derek's legs entirely gave out. He collapsed hard onto the kitchen floor, hitting his knees against the stone tiles. He began to hyperventilate, gasping for air as tears streamed down his face in thick, heavy rivers. He scrambled forward on his hands and knees, crawling across the expensive floor directly toward me. He reached out with shaking hands and grabbed the hem of my outdated suit pants. He looked up at me, his face completely distorted by absolute pathetic terror. He began sobbing, uncontrollably begging for mercy. He cried out, asking me to stop them, telling me that he was my son, my only boy. He pleaded with me, reminding me of the times we used to play catch in the yard, bringing up the memory of his mother, baking his favorite birthday cakes. He begged Sarah to intervene, crying out to her that he was sorry, that he would give every single penny back, that he would spend the rest of his life making it up to us. He squeezed my leg, sobbing that a father could not possibly send his own child to a state penitentiary. I looked down at the man crying at my feet. The guests had entirely fled the room, leaving only Sarah, Samuel, the deputies, and me to witness this final pathetic display. I felt a massive, heavy wave of sorrow wash over my chest. It was a deep, visceral ache that settled right behind my ribs. A parent never truly wants to see their child in chains. You spend your entire life trying to protect them from the harsh cruelties of the world. You sacrifice your own dreams so they can have a better starting line. Looking down at his tear-streaked face, a tiny fragmented part of my memory flashed back to the day he was born, to the absolute, overwhelming love I felt holding his tiny hand in the hospital nursery. But that innocent boy was dead. The man gripping my pant leg was not my son. He was a ruthless, calculating predator who had placed a financial knife against my throat and tried to bury my wife and me alive. If he had successfully secured that $200,000 loan tomorrow morning, he would be laughing on a first-class flight to Europe while federal banks foreclosed on my life. He was not crying because he regretted hurting his parents. He was crying because he had been caught. He was begging for himself, not for us. I reached down and slowly, firmly peeled his shaking fingers off the fabric of my trousers. I took a deliberate step backwards, severing the physical connection between us. I looked deep into his terrified eyes, and I did not let an ounce of weakness show in my voice. I spoke with the calm, absolute authority of a man who had survived the ultimate betrayal. I told him that I had given him every single advantage in this world. I gave him my work ethic, my morality, and every dollar I could spare. I told him that he had taken all of those gifts and threw them in the garbage for a taste of fake luxury. I told him that a real man accepts the consequences of his own actions. I told him he dug this massive grave with his own 2 hands, and now he was going to have to lie in it. I turned my face away from him. I looked at the lead deputy and gave a slow, firm nod. The officer grabbed Derek by the back of his expensive suit jacket, hoisted him roughly to his feet, and slammed him against the marble counter. The sharp clicking of the handcuffs snapping shut around my son's wrists was the final, absolute punctuation mark on his stolen legacy. Derek sobbed loudly, his head hanging in absolute defeat, as the deputy read him his Miranda rights. They marched him down the grand hallway, following the path his screaming wife had just taken. We followed slowly behind them. We stood in the grand foyer, watching through the massive glass front doors. The crisp autumn night was completely illuminated by the frantic spinning red and blue lights of 4 county police cruisers parked in the sweeping driveway. The wealthy neighbors from the surrounding luxury estates were standing on their manicured lawns, watching in absolute shock as the young corporate prince and his glamorous wife were shoved roughly into the back of caged police vehicles. The entire neighborhood watched their perfect suburban illusion burn to the ground. The cruisers backed out of the driveway, their sirens wailing briefly, as they sped off down the dark, winding roads, carrying the absolute worst mistake of my life, away to a cold, concrete cell. The heavy police lights faded into the distance, leaving the property bathed in the soft glow of the outdoor landscape lighting. The catering van had hastily packed up and fled. The driveway was completely empty, except for our beat-up sedan and Samuel's reliable car. The massive mansion was entirely silent. Samuel turned to me, placing a warm, heavy hand on my shoulder. He did not offer any empty platitudes. He simply told me that I had done the hardest, most necessary thing a man could ever do. He told me that I had protected my household and that justice, no matter how painful it feels in the moment, is always the right path. He gave Sarah a gentle nod, picked up his battered briefcase, and walked out to his car, leaving us alone in the grand foyer of our new home. Sarah and I walked slowly back into the massive living area. The remnants of the Thanksgiving feast were still sitting on the mahogany table, completely untouched. Half-full champagne flutes were scattered across the counters. The expensive jazz music was still playing softly from the hidden speakers. The house felt massive, echoing, and incredibly empty. But as I stood there holding my wife's hand, looking around at the vaulted ceilings and the crystal chandeliers, I did not feel empty. I felt an overwhelming, powerful sense of vindication. The toxic rot that had infected my family had been completely and surgically excised. The evil had been thoroughly purged from our lives. We had faced the absolute darkest depths of human greed, and we had emerged completely victorious. The money that represented my lifetime of grueling labor had not been wasted. It had legally purchased this fortress, and we were the undisputed absolute owners. The pain of losing a child to his own wickedness would probably linger in my heart for the rest of my days. But the peace of knowing we had stood our ground, fought for our dignity, and won was a profound healing balm. We were not victims. We were survivors. We were fighters. We had taken the absolute worst blow imaginable and turned it into the ultimate triumph. If you are watching this video right now, I want you to listen to me very carefully. Sometimes the greatest threats we face in this life do not come from strangers lurking in the dark. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the people sitting right across from us at the Thanksgiving table. Blood does not automatically guarantee loyalty, and family does not automatically guarantee love. Never let anyone, regardless of who they are, use your kindness as a weakness. Protect your assets, protect your spirit, and never be afraid to drop the hammer of justice on anyone who tries to bury you in the dark. You have a right to your dignity, and you have an absolute right to fight back. If my story resonated with you, if you understand the heavy, painful necessity of standing up for what is yours, please hit the like button right now to support this channel. It helps push these important warnings out to other people who might be facing their own hidden battles. Please subscribe to the Long Haul Dad channel so you never miss another story of survival and absolute justice. And I want to hear from you. Tell me down in the comments exactly what city or country you are watching this video from and what time it is there right now. It brings a tremendous amount of joy to this old man's heart to know that my voice is reaching good, honest, hardworking people across the entire globe. Stay strong, protect your peace, and always demand the respect you have rightfully earned. The morning we officially took possession of that sprawling northern suburb mansion was one of the quietest days of my entire life. Sarah and I drove up that long, manicured driveway, not as uninvited guests crashing a high society party, but as the sole lawful owners of the estate. The county courts had processed the constructive trust paperwork with incredible speed. With the rightful title securely in our names, we unlocked the heavy mahogany front doors and stepped inside. The massive crystal chandeliers hung silently. The imported marble floors were swept clean of the shattered glass from Todd's dropped bourbon glass. All the arrogant laughter, the clinking champagne flutes, and the mocking whispers were entirely gone. It was just an empty, echoing shell of a house built on a foundation of absolute deceit. We walked through this vaulted living room and into that private home office where Derek had so carelessly left our stolen bank statements out in the open. I stood by the bay windows, looking out over the perfectly trimmed lawns. There was absolutely no joy in acquiring this place. To us, it was not a palace. It was a crime scene. It was a physical monument to the toxic greed that had completely consumed our only child. Sarah came up beside me, her hand slipping gently into mine. We did not even need to discuss it. We both knew we could never live within these walls. The very air inside felt tainted by their betrayal. We contacted a reputable real estate agent that very afternoon and listed the property on the market. We wanted a swift, completely clean break from the entire suburban nightmare. Because the property had been purchased entirely in cash with no complicated mortgage liens or secondary lenders attached, the listing process was incredibly smooth. Furthermore, the housing market in the affluent northern suburbs was aggressively competitive. Wealthy buyers were practically lining up to acquire a turnkey luxury estate. Within 2 weeks, we received a phenomenal cash offer that far exceeded the initial purchase price. The closing process was handled meticulously by our attorneys, ensuring every single document was legally bulletproof. Sitting at the long conference table in the law office, watching the escrow agent authorize the final wire transfer, was a moment of profound, overwhelming relief. When I logged into our new highly secured banking portal the next morning, the numbers staring back at me were beautifully, undeniably real. Not only had we recovered the original $246,000 that represented my life savings, but the rapid appreciation and the aggressive cash sale of the mansion had netted us a substantial 6-figure profit. My hands, the same calloused hands that had gripped a city bus steering wheel for 4 decades, finally stopped carrying the heavy, agonizing weight of financial ruin. The blood and sweat I had poured into my 35-year career had been entirely vindicated. We were whole again. We were secure. While our financial world was being meticulously rebuilt, the people who had tried to bury us alive were facing the absolute catastrophic destruction of their own making. The state and federal authorities had built an ironclad case against the three of them. Derek, Jessica, and Todd were currently sitting in county holding facilities, awaiting their formal federal sentencing hearings. The charges were staggering: felony elder financial abuse, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering, and a laundry list of secondary banking violations. Todd's boutique real estate brokerage had been completely dismantled by federal regulators, his professional license permanently revoked. Jessica, the socialite, who had treated my wife like a servant, was now wearing a state-issued uniform, entirely stripped of her diamonds, her silk gowns, and her arrogant pride. And then there was Derek. Sitting in the gallery of the federal courthouse during his arraignment was one of the most agonizing experiences of my 68 years on this earth. Seeing my son, the boy I had taught to throw a baseball, the young man I had worked endless double shifts to put through college, shuffling into the courtroom in waist chains and handcuffs, completely broke a hidden, fragile part of my heart. His tailored charcoal suits were gone. His arrogant corporate swagger had completely evaporated. He looked incredibly small, terrified, and utterly defeated. When he glanced back at the gallery and made eye contact with me, his eyes were filled with a desperate, pleading sorrow. He wept openly, begging the judge for leniency, claiming he had made a terrible, misguided mistake. But a mistake is forgetting to pay a utility bill. A mistake is backing your car into a mailbox. Methodically researching a legal loophole, forging a sick old man's signature, stealing $250,000, and plotting to flee the country while leaving your parents to face absolute destitution is not a mistake. It is a calculated, vicious act of pure evil. I did not turn my gaze away from him, but I did not offer him a forgiving smile either. A father's love is a profound, unconditional force, but it does not mean I have to endure the destruction of my household. I felt a heavy, monumental sorrow for the boy he used to be, but I felt an absolute, unyielding peace knowing I had done my duty as a husband. I had protected Sarah. I had fiercely defended our dignity. The malignant, toxic rot had been permanently excised from our family tree. The truth, no matter how deeply they had tried to bury it, beneath fake smiles and stolen mansions, had risen into the blinding light of day. With the nightmare officially behind us, Sarah and I decided it was time to leave the noise and the painful memories of Atlanta behind. We took a portion of our recovered funds and purchased a beautiful, quiet log cabin nestled on the edge of a pristine lake up in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It is a modest, comfortable place far away from the aggressive hustle of the city and the toxic arrogance of suburban high society. My mornings no longer begin with the roar of diesel engines or the agonizing stress of a legal war. I wake up to the gentle sound of water lapping against the wooden dock and the morning calls of the blue herons. Sarah has a small garden out back where she grows tomatoes and vibrant hydrangeas. Her laughter, the warm, beautiful sound I feared had been permanently stolen from her, has completely returned. We sit on our back porch in the evenings, wrapped in thick wool blankets, drinking hot tea and watching the sun sink below the tree line, painting the water in brilliant shades of gold and purple. The ache in my leg from the stroke still flares up when the weather turns cold, but my spirit has never been stronger. We are finally living the peaceful, hard-earned retirement we were promised. We survived the darkest storm a parent could ever face, and we built our own sanctuary in the aftermath. If you are sitting there listening to my voice today, I want you to carry this truth with you for the rest of your life. The hardest lesson a man can learn is that sharing a bloodline does not guarantee loyalty. Sometimes the people who call you family are the exact same people standing behind you with a knife waiting for you to stumble. You must always protect your peace, fiercely guard your assets, and never let anyone mistake your quiet patience for weakness. You have an absolute right to defend your dignity, no matter who is standing on the other side of the battlefield. The truth always demands to be heard, and justice will find a way if you are brave enough to fight for it. If my journey resonated with your heart, if you believe in standing tall against the wicked and protecting the people you love, please hit that like button right now. It helps bring a little bit of sunshine and encouragement to this old man's day. Make sure you subscribe to the Long Haul Dad channel so you never miss out on these powerful stories of survival and redemption. And before you go, I want you to drop a comment below and tell me exactly what city, state, or country you are watching from, and what time it is there right now. It brings a tremendous amount of joy to my soul to know that my words are reaching good, honest folks all across the globe. Stay strong, protect your household, and always demand the respect you have rightfully earned. A big hug the size of my heart to all of you. Listen to me closely, my friends. We spend our entire lives breaking our backs to build a solid foundation for the people we love. As hardworking parents, we are naturally hardwired to give our children the world. I drove those heavy city buses through sleet and blistering heat for 4 long decades, just to make sure my boy had a better starting line than I ever did. But I am here today to tell you right now that loving your children does not mean you have to surrender your hard-earned dignity. You can give them your whole heart, but you must never blindly hand over your future, your sweat and your tears, without completely protecting yourselves first. Blood does not always mean loyalty. It is a harsh and very bitter pill to swallow, but it is the absolute truth in this modern world. We desperately want to believe the best about the children we raised in our own homes. We want to trust them implicitly with our care. But you have to keep your eyes wide open. If you are sitting there listening to my voice today, please take this urgent warning to heart. Always have a secure and reliable backup plan ready. Protect your financial assets with ironclad legal boundaries. And above all else, never sign a single piece of paper, especially when you are sick or physically vulnerable, without fully understanding every single word printed on that page. Do not let anyone rush your decisions. Do not let anyone dismiss your valid questions. Your legacy is your personal fortress, and you have an absolute, undeniable right to defend those gates. You worked far too hard for your piece of the American dream, to let someone else devour it while you are left to starve. If my journey touched your spirit today, if you truly understand the deep, painful necessity of standing tall against deception and protecting your household, please hit that like button right now. Doing that simple act helps bring a little bit of warm sunshine and daily encouragement to the heart of this old father. It tells me that my truth is reaching the exact people who need to hear it most. Make sure you also subscribe to the channel so you do not miss my next real-life stories of survival and redemption. We are building a mighty community of strong, resilient folks right here, and I genuinely want you to be a part of it. And before you leave, please tell me down in the comments exactly what city, state, or country you are watching this video from, and what time it is there right now. Are you drinking your early morning coffee or winding down after a long, exhausting shift? It brings me so much profound joy to know exactly where my brothers and sisters are tuning in from across this great country and all around the globe. We are all deeply connected by our shared struggles and our hard-won triumphs. Stay eternally vigilant, protect your peace of mind, and never let any person steal your hard-earned crown. I will see you in the next story. May God bless those who walk the righteous path.